Spring 1944. The Pacific was vast, blue and treacherous, a hunter's ocean where steel predators waited unseen. Beneath those restless swells, the Imperial Japanese Navy's submarines prowled with grim patience, waiting for convoys heavy with American supplies to cross their range. In the early years of the war, the submariners had been hunters. Now, as the tide turned against Japan, they were hunted, though not yet by the weapon that would soon define the last year of their existence. The United States Navy had learned the hard way that the ocean's depths protected its most elusive enemy. Conventional depth charges, heavy steel barrels filled with TNT, were crude but familiar tools. Sailors would roll them off the stern, watch them sink, and count the seconds until they detonated. They made thunder that could be felt in the chest, but the results were uncertain. The explosions shook the sea, raised geysers of foam, and sent sound through the hull like hammer blows. Yet time and again, when the bubbles cleared, sonar would whisper the same mocking truth. Contact still present. A depth charge might explode too shallow or too deep, or several yards to one side. In the three-dimensional wilderness of the ocean, close enough was often not enough at all. Anti-submarine warfare was part science, part art, and largely hope. The grim joke among destroyer crews was that it took 100 depth charges to get one kill. An exaggeration, but not by much. In Washington, in British Admiralty offices, and in the long, low testing ranges along the coasts, engineers knew that if the Allies could not make submarine killing faster and more precise, the shipping lanes would bleed out faster than the shipyards could replace their losses. The birth of a better idea. The weapon that would end that long guessing game was not born from a general's vision, but from a handful of engineers who refused to accept that near miss was good enough. In 1941, as Britain fought for its life against German U-boats, a small team at the Admiralty's Directorate of Miscellaneous Weapons Development began experimenting with forward-throwing projectiles. Their goal was simple but radical. Instead of dropping explosives behind a pursuing destroyer, why not throw them ahead into the path of the submarine itself? That meant the sonar contact, which usually had to be broken while a ship passed over its target, could be maintained right up to the moment of firing. The new system would project a spread of contact-fused bombs, each one exploding only when it struck a submarine's hull. That device would be christened the Hedgehog, not because of any zoological resemblance, but because the first prototypes looked like the spiny back of an animal, with dozens of stubby mortar spigots poking upward from a circular launcher. The name stuck. And by the time America entered the war, the Royal Navy's experiments had already proven that the Hedgehog could kill where depth charges merely threatened. It would not produce the thunderous underwater blossoms that destroyer crews had grown used to seeing. If it missed, it produced nothing at all. But when it hit, when those contact bombs slammed into a steel pressure hull, the result was unmistakable. Adopted by America by 1943, the U.S. Navy was adapting the Hedgehog to its destroyer escorts, the new, smaller warships built specifically for anti-submarine work. The Hedgehog launcher, consisting of 24 angled tubes, each firing a 65-pound projectile, was mounted on the foredeck just ahead of the bridge. When fired, the pattern of bombs would land in an elliptical spread about 250 yards ahead of the ship, covering an area roughly the size of a football field. Each projectile carried 35 pounds of Torpex, a powerful explosive 50% stronger than TNT. But the true innovation was the contact fuse. The bombs would sink silently until one of them struck metal, then detonate instantly. There were no wasted explosions, no noise to obscure sonar returns, and no false victories. To sailors accustomed to the rolling thunder of depth charge barrages, The Hedgehog's silence felt eerie. A ship would race forward, sonar men calling range and bearing. "Contact steady!" the captain would order. "Fire!" The deck would jolt slightly, the brief thump, thump, thump as the mortars discharged. Then nothing. Just the slap of wind and spray, seconds stretched into half a minute, sometimes more. Then, if the gods of war were kind, the stillness would shatter. A dull, heavy whump beneath the surface, followed by a rising plume of dark oil and wreckage. That moment, the sudden bloom of triumph out of quiet, was unlike anything else in the war at sea. The submarine menace. By 1944, Japan had lost many of its best submariners, but it still maintained dozens of operational boats across the Pacific, from the Philippines to the Marshall Islands. Their mission was changing. Once they had hunted American carriers, now they were tasked with interdicting the endless lifelines of supply and reinforcement stretching across the ocean. Japanese submarine captains were brave, but they were handicapped. Their boats were slower to dive than American or German subs, their sonar less sensitive, and their doctrine still clinging to the glory days of fleet action. Yet under the right conditions, they could still kill. And by early 1944, a handful of American destroyer escorts were assigned to a dangerous job: to hunt them down. One of these ships was the USS England, DE 635, a Buckley-class destroyer escort named in honor of Ensign John C. England, who had died at Pearl Harbor. Her crew was young, barely trained when she joined the Pacific Fleet in early 1944. None could have guessed that this modest 306-foot vessel would soon achieve one of the most extraordinary records in naval history: the destruction of 7 Japanese submarines in 12 days, a sea of silence. Before the storm, the England's war began quietly. Her deck smelled of paint and salt. The engines throbbed steadily beneath her feet. She was a small ship compared to the mighty carriers and cruisers she escorted. Only 3 3-inch guns, a few torpedo tubes, a Hedgehog launcher on the forecastle, and racks of depth charges at the stern. But she carried something far more valuable: a crew drilled in the new science of submarine hunting. In May 1944, Task Group 30.4 was ordered to patrol the approaches to the Solomon Islands. Intelligence had intercepted Japanese radio traffic. Several submarines were believed to be transiting south from Truk toward New Guinea to intercept American invasion convoys. To the men aboard England, it sounded like routine duty. To history, it would be the beginning of a legend. Contact. On the morning of May 19, 1944, England's sonar operator, a young seaman named Richard C. Sank, leaned into his headset and frowned. Amid the rhythmic echoes of the seafloor, a sharper pulse returned. Metallic, distinct, steady. He adjusted the gain. The blip moved slightly to port, about 1,500 yards ahead, depth estimated at 150 feet. Bridge, sonar contact bearing 085, range 1500 yards, moving left to right. Commander Walton B. Pendleton, England's captain, was already on the bridge. He gave a short nod. "Helm, steady on course. Increase to 15 knots. On the deck, sailors hurried to their stations. The Hedgehog crew checked fuses, armed the projectiles, and swung the launcher into position. The ship's sonar pinged steadily, each return marking the unseen target below. Pendleton waited until the range closed. "Fire 1 pattern." The sound was almost anticlimactic, a muffled thump, thump, thump as 24 spigots launched their deadly cargo forward. The projectiles arced into the air and disappeared beneath the waves 200 yards ahead. Then silence. Men held their breath. 20 seconds, 30, then whump! A single explosion rumbled through the hull. A column of brown water rose 50 feet into the air. Moments later, oil slicks spread across the surface, followed by debris. Wood fragments, insulation, a single shoe. The England had just killed I-16, a Japanese transport submarine en route to New Guinea, the first hedgehog kill of her campaign. The crew cheered, but Pendleton remained composed. "Mark position," he said quietly. "We'll write it up later." The next 11 days would bring 6 more kills. A revolution-proven word spread quickly through the fleet. Other destroyer escorts listened in disbelief as reports came over the radio. England had sunk another sub, then another, then another. In those 2 weeks of May 1944, the Buckley-class escort and her Hedgehog launcher demonstrated what no amount of theory or testing could, that the balance between hunter and hunted had finally tipped. At Pearl Harbor, Admiral Ernest King reportedly commented, "There'll always be an England in the United States Navy." But for the men who served on her, the real story was the Hedgehog itself, a squat, ugly little contraption of tubes and fuses that had finally made anti-submarine warfare a matter of precision instead of luck. As the Pacific rolled on toward its violent climax, one thing was certain. Beneath those blue waves, the silent war had changed forever. They called it quiet killing. To men who'd grown up with the cinematic thunder of depth-charge barrages, the Hedgehog's silence felt unnatural, almost clinical. But silence was the Hedgehog's friend. Instead of filling the sea with noise that masked returns on sonar, the forward-thrown projectiles only sang when they touched cold steel. That single fact changed everything about how a hunter could close with a hunted submarine. Picture a circular rack of short mortar tubes on the forecastle of a destroyer escort. When fired, the rack spat 24 small spigot mortars in a tight elliptical pattern some 200 to 300 yards ahead of the ship. Each round carried a high-energy Torpex charge and, crucially, a contact fuse, meaning the warhead detonated only on impact with a hull. No hit, no explosion. No explosion, sonar remained clean. That allowed the ship to hold its contact and immediately know whether it had scored a kill. Compared to depth charges, which detonated on preset timers at uncertain depths, Hedgehog was surgical. Mechanically, the system was simple. Operationally, it demanded exactness. The sonar operator had to hold contact through the attack run. The captain had to steer a steady course so the predicted spread would fall squarely where the sub was believed to be. The helmsman had to trust the plot while the gunners on deck readied the mortars. In an age of improvisation and grit, Hedgehog married engineering with seamanship. Its success depended on human discipline as much as on metal and detonators. For crews trained on the storm of depth charges, the Hedgehog's method was almost meditative. An attack began with the impatient drum of sonar pings and the brittle voice of the contact operator. Men moved to stations with the hurt, easy rhythm of routine. Fire commands came with terse economy. The mortars kicked like a quick fist and then nothing. Silence stretched. The kind of silence that roared in a sailor's ears. Then, if the heavens and the fuses were kind, the sea answered with the muted subterranean whump of impact and then the slow, awful bloom of oil and wreckage, and one moment you had a contact, the next you had proof. That confirmation, black oil and timbers on the surface, was addictive. It meant a life once lurking below would never surface again. After I-16's destruction on 19th May, the task group continued to press the patrol line established by Japanese commanders around the approaches to the Admiralty Islands. On 22nd of May, sonar again returned a clear, low-voiced echo, a contact bearing and depth that matched the plotted sweep of the patrol line. England dogged the target. The attack play was textbook: circle to regain the best track, approach at speed, fire a pre-aimed Hedgehog pattern and hold contact. This time the contact came back with violence. The forward pattern struck home. A single solid detonation erupted beneath the surface, and shortly after the sea boiled with oil and debris. The ship lost was RO-106, her hull torn, her crew gone. The next day's log recorded the kill almost laconically, but among the men there was a quiet sense of awe that the little destroyer escort had done it again. The very next day, 23rd of May, radar and sonar plotted another submarine dead in the water. A multi-ship tactic unfolded. The supporting escorts created a circling pattern to hold and localize the contact while England steamed in to deliver a forward pattern. The Hedgehog hit RO-104. Witness accounts describe the sudden bloom, the telltale sign: oil, cork hull fragments, an overturned collapsible boat, and flooring that struck the surface and never floated empty. There were, of course, the quiet notches in the logbooks, the gunner's silence, the clump of men who could only watch and later mark position and write reports. Another submarine was added to the ledger. By 24th May, the rhythm of attack had become fierce and mechanical. Enemy subs in the patrol line tried to reposition, but the Allied net of radar-equipped escorts and aircraft was beginning to close. That morning, echo bearings once more revealed a target, and England executed the now familiar drill: approach, fire, maintain sonar. RO-166, like the boats before her, was knocked out with surgical certainty. Post-war records confirmed the match between the position of the Hedgehog explosions and the loss of RO-116. The small deadly pattern of contact bombs, combined with the tactical intelligence that funneled the subs into Allied traps, was proving decisive. 2 days later, 26 May, the hunter-killer group was reinforced by carrier-based aircraft and additional escorts operating out of Manus and other forward bases. That additional coverage tightened the noose. On patrol that day, the task group developed a radar-sonar contact that suggested a sub was trying to sneak under the cover of darkness or heavy seas. England closed and delivered another forward pattern. The sea again answered with oil and wreckage. RO-108 sank where she had tried to hide. If a crewman's private horror during this campaign was the sudden absence of sound, the public dread was the knowledge that patrol lines had stopped being opportunities. They had become traps. What Japanese planners had intended as an interception barrier instead became a meat rail as Allied detection and Hedgehog tactics converged. The final confirmed loss attributed to England's unique run was RO-105, sunk on 31st May. The pattern of events was familiar by now. Intercept message, radar and sonar plotting, coordinated circling and echo ranging by supporting escorts, England's approach and Hedgehog discharge, and then the telltale confirmation. Bubbles, oil, floating wreckage. The kill on 31st May completed the sequence of 6 submarines neutralized in 12 days, an achievement unmatched by any single Allied warship in World War II. When you step back from the theater-intense retelling, 3 clear lessons explain why the Hedgehog run succeeded, where depth charges often failed. First, contact retention. Hedgehog allowed the hunter to keep sonar contact up to the moment of attack. Depth charges, by contrast, required the ship to pass over the target and often lost or corrupted the contact. Second, precision over noise. Contact fuses eliminated wasted detonations and the false clutter of multiple depth charge explosions. You either had a hit and unmistakable evidence at the surface, or silence. The Navy loved that binary outcome. Third, intelligence and coordination. The kill chain was not merely a single captain and a gadget. It relied on signals intelligence, radar scouting, coordinated echo ranging, and aircraft coverage that prevented submarines from moving freely. Hedgehog simply made the final act of killing far more reliable when all those pieces were in place. From the Japanese perspective, what happened in those 12 days must have looked like a rapid collapse of a carefully laid plan. Tokyo had placed submarines in a picket line to ambush American forces. Instead, the Allies reversed the trap into a kill zone. Reports after the war and Japanese tabular records list the missing submarines and the dates they were lost. For Imperial Navy officers who read those messages, the sudden and repeated localized losses were unnerving evidence of a new, effective Allied technique. The operational lessons spread quickly through Allied fleets. Commanders who had viewed destroyer escorts as mere convoy shepherds began to see them as precision weapons. Crews trained specifically on hedgehog gunnery, mastering the geometry of the spread, the patience of silent approach, and the discipline of the sonar room. In those late months of the Pacific War, technology and training had finally caught up with courage. And the ocean, once ruled by the unseen, belonged again to those who sailed on its surface. They smelled like diesel and gun oil and the salt that clung to everything in the tropics. On England, the decks were still warm from the sun. Men who had grown up ashore in cities and farms now moved with the easy competence of a crew who had learned to trust one another with their lives. On more than one watch, the conversation had run to baseball scores and the names of girls back home, then snapped back to sonar, to bearings and ranges, to the breath hold of an attack run. That ordinary banality made victory feel less like spectacle and more like inevitable work. Contact, bearing 085, range now 950, the sonar operator said, his voice steady but clipped. In the dark, his eyes darted between the scopes as if the pings were small animals moving inside the instruments. The captain did not flinch. Steady on course, propulsion, bring her up to 14, he ordered. The helmsman's hands were oil-slick and sure. Around them, men moved like clockwork, the hedgehog crew checking the spigots, the gunners aligning the sight, the radio operator half listening to other ships in the group. Below the waves, in a cramped steel tube no longer than a block of apartments, a Japanese submariner thumbed his knees and listened to the slow groan of pumps and the distant throb of diesel. He had been ordered south and west to intercept a convoy. He knew the odds. Never good, never guaranteed. Still, there was ritual in running a patrol, check the trim, confirm the compass, scrub the deck with rough cloths until the salt haze was a memory. He thought of home, perhaps of a sister in Yokohama or a father in Hiroshima, and then of his orders. He breathed and watched the gauges. The first run in which England's mortars struck home in that string of strikes had felt to those on deck like something close to divine attention. The men would say later that the ocean itself seemed to answer, but in truth, it was all geometry and timing and the stubborn repetition of drills. Once the spigots fired and the pattern sank into the water, a silence fell that was not emptiness but compressed attention. In those seconds, sailors discovered the particular terror of waiting for the sea to tell you what you had done. When the whump came, the impact echoed through the hull like an answering bell. It was not the showy flash that old salts favored, the geysers and spouts of depth-charge explosions, but a heavy subterranean rupture that would not be mistaken. Men crowded the rail, eyes narrowing against the spray. Brown oil surfaced, then black, then timbers and a boot and the silent arc of what had been a life. The capstan hummed. Somewhere someone made a quick tally on a slate. The captain called in the position to the task group dryly. Mark position, Bravo 2, we have a kill. Word moved faster than the ships themselves. When flags and radio confirmed the second and third contacts, the tone aboard carrier and escort alike shifted. What had been cautious optimism became a quiet, hard confidence. Crewmen who had never expected a medal stared at each other and felt the shift of history under their soul. The England's bridge became a place of calm fury, work, not triumph. Inside the Japanese command rooms, the news traveled differently. The Admiralty in Tokyo received dispatches couched in clipped naval terms: lost contacts, failed communications, a sub overdue. Messages were repeated twice, 3 times in the hope of catching a transcription error. When the pattern emerged, subs lost in a small area in quick succession, panic did not announce itself with trumpets. It crept in like a draft through a poorly sealed door. Conversations tightened, routes were rerouted, orders flew like nervous birds across the Empire's network. In forward bases, commanders who had ordered picket lines to trap American convoys now read the casualty rosters with white faces and closed mouths. They had expected attrition spread thin across months, not concentrated in a small, blazing window of days. Men who survived those kills would tell the same scenes in small, different ways. The sonar operator on England, years later, gray at the temples and prone to telling the story with his hand over his heart, would talk about the sound as if it were a person. The slight, stubborn echo that would not be confused with thermoclines or reef reflections. He would describe how, on one night, he had been convinced the contact was broken, but the echoes, finer and sharper, returned. "Hold until I say break," the captain had told him. He had held. The mortars fired. There came that slow, subterranean whoomp. "Sometimes," the operator said, "you feel like you were given proof that the sea keeps accounts." On board the submarines, there were moments of bewilderment, light at the portholes, a sudden shudder as something tremendous connected with the outside of the hull. Men had no time to write last words. There was a flurry of metal and water, a final series of orders shouted in hurried Japanese, then silence, which in the depths meant an end. The day they lost 3 in as many days, the mood among Japanese sailors shifted from professional concern to existential dread. They whispered rumors, aircraft equipped with devil's guns that cut steel, torpedoes that detonated without warning. When captured sailors were later debriefed, they muttered the same image: a metal beast bearing down with a nose of fire. In the math of war, that image was a neat shorthand for the horror of facing a new, efficient killer. Allied intelligence had played its role. The pattern of movement was not only a product of honeys and hedgehogs, it was a triumph of coordination among carriers, escorts, and intercept operators. Plane sightings, radar sweeps, and decoded messages funneled the cubes into a corridor where men like the Captain of England could hunt them with near certainty. The story of the 12 days was not a tale of one ship alone, but of an entire apparatus that had learned to read the sea and then to punish it precisely. After each strike, the rescue work began in earnest. Even as men celebrated the tactical success, order shifted to humanity. Boats were lowered, lines cast, and the water became a field of floating shapes: wood, canvas, and the occasional survivor. It was in these hours that the war's contradictions became most visible. The same hands that had loaded mortars and watched sonar scopes now hauled shivering figures into life rafts. In one instance, an Australian pilot who had watched from above later described the bizarre closeness of the scene. "We had just watched a hull split open and then found a drifting pair of eyes. You fly to kill, but you land to save, and the 2 acts live in the same mind like enemies at table." Debriefings that followed each encounter were meticulous. Men wrote with a near-sacred seriousness. Sonar graphs were taped to bulletin boards, notes compared with ship logs, radio traffic printed and filed. Naval brass, always hungry for good news, took the story of the England and handed it to the press in careful measures. Headlines across small papers ran with pride. Men at home read the dispatches and checked their sons' names off in parish rolls. Yet even in victory, the Navy was careful to present the campaign as process rather than miracle. Hedgehog was a tool, and tools in the Navy's hands became doctrine only after they proved repeatable. The repeatability was the measure that turned applause into policy. In Tokyo, the loss of those submarines, so many in so small a span, forced strategy meetings that had a different tone. Generals and admirals paced in low-lit rooms, rubbing at their necks and trading maps like an illness they each hoped to contain. The decision to alter submarine deployment was less about emotion than arithmetic. How to preserve the remaining fleet, how to continue to harass Allied supply lines while avoiding the predatory net now springing around the islands. The choices were about ceding control of the sea lanes, about accepting that night runs and submarines alone could not replace the tonnage once moved by daylight convoys. Those were not merely operational changes, they were early witnesses to a logistical collapse that, given time, would hollow the island defenses that had once seemed unassailable. After-action letters from England's crew were as much about small mercies as they were about strategic proof. A petty officer wrote home about a quiet afternoon when they received bread and oranges from an aircraft carrier passing overhead, a tiny comfort. A signalman later wrote, in careful looping script, of how the ship's boys had lined up to strap on clean clothes when they could, as if order and small rituals kept the sea from taking more than the crew could bear. Awards followed the campaign. Men earned ribbons and commendations for seamanship and for the coolness with which they executed the new tactics, but among the crew the real currency was the knowledge that their tedious drills and repeated runs had become something larger than themselves. A small hammer turning the tide in the vast machine of war. They told each other stories that balanced technical detail with human moments. The sonar operator who refused to leave his post, the gunner who adjusted a fuse with hands slipping from sweat, the junior officer who steadied an anxious lookout with a barked joke. Those stories stitched the crew together into a narrative that outlasted the medals. At sea, time is measured in knots and degrees and the length of watches. For those 12 days, those measures kept score. When at last the patrols moved on, the group's record lay like a map of small, hard victories. Men who had been novices became veterans overnight. Commanders who had piloted destroyers for months found themselves called into briefings to advise on Hedgehog placements and attack runs. Hedgehog, once a novelty, was now an instrument of doctrine. The submariner's absence left other ripples. Convoys adjusted their courses, night movement increased, and the Japanese Navy's once bold plans to form interception lines farther from friendly bases lost their teeth. Where a submarine had seemed a ghost in the dark, now there lurked ahead of it a pattern of steel and water and men trained to kill precisely. And in the quiet that followed each engagement, when decks were swabbed and tools put away, the men of England would sometimes gather at sundown and listen to the ocean. They would recall faces and names and debates from home, the birthdays and the small grievances, and they would laugh at each other's jokes and, if the mood came, fall into silence, the kind that wraps like a shawl around the shoulders. In that silence, there was not only the weight of victory but the cost it carried, and a recognition that in winning precisely, they had also ushered in a new kind of war, one in which the ocean itself could no longer hide its enemies. When the sun climbed over the Pacific and the sea turned gold around them, the men of England had already been awake for hours. The engines hummed with a rhythm they could feel through the soles of their boots. Breakfast was powdered eggs and coffee strong enough to strip paint. Somewhere a phonograph scraped out the Andrews sisters through the static. They were barely out of their teens, most of them dumb-tune, but in those days a year at sea made you older than your father had been at 30. After the 6 submarines were gone, the task group kept patrolling, but the atmosphere on board had changed. It wasn't celebration, no cheering or champagne, just a quiet satisfaction and a strange humility. They'd been part of something rare and they knew it. The ship's log was matter-of-fact about the victories. But the faces of the crew told the deeper story. Eyes red from sleepless watches, hands nicked and bruised from handling steel and salt, minds still tuned to the rhythm of sonar pings echoing inside their skulls. Mail from home came that week, clumsy bundles of envelopes in waterproof sacks. One man received a photo of a newborn son, another a clipping of the St. Louis Cardinals box score. For a few hours they laughed again, telling the same jokes about home and pretending that the world had not changed beneath their feet. Then the klaxon would sound and they'd go running, because in wartime peace never lasted long enough to believe in. The Navy sent word back to Pearl Harbor and Washington. Admirals who had once been skeptical of destroyer escorts began to talk about them in new tones. A small ship, one report said, but an enormous proof of concept. Engineers and tacticians from the Bureau of Ordnance began combing through England's after-action reports. They studied sonar traces, hedgehog firing angles, even the wind direction at the moment of each attack. What they found was not luck, it was a formula. Hedgehog had made anti-submarine warfare precise, and England had shown it could be relentless. In Tokyo, the silence from the missing submarines could not be ignored. Families of sailors began receiving the soft-voiced telegrams that the Imperial Navy had perfected. Phrases like, "missing in action," and "fate unknown." The command suspected what had happened but could hardly believe it. They had expected submarines to vanish one at a time, scattered across months of combat, not in a single fortnight within one small corner of the ocean. They called the stretch of sea between Truk and the Solomons the corridor of death. But few outside intelligence circles ever knew how it had earned the name. American journalists eventually got hold of the story, though the details were filtered through military censors. Newspapers in June 1944 carried modest headlines, "Destroyer escort sinks 6 subs." The public saw a line or two, never realizing that it represented one of the most concentrated anti-submarine successes in naval history. Veterans of the Atlantic campaign against the German U-boats raised an eyebrow in appreciation. They knew how hard it was to sink even one submarine. 6 in 12 days was almost beyond comprehension. For the men on England, the war rolled on. They were sent to escort carriers near the Marianas and later to Okinawa. They fired at kamikazes, dodged torpedoes, and stood night watches that seemed to stretch across entire oceans. But the legend of those 12 days followed them. Whenever a new sailor came aboard, someone would point to the Hedgehog launcher and say, "That's what did it." The weapon had become a totem, both terrifying and sacred. Years later, when the war was over and the seas were quiet again, old shipmates would meet at reunions in faded naval halls. They would talk about the smell of cordite, the hum of the engines, the way the sonar's pings seemed to echo in their bones long after the ship had gone home. Someone would inevitably say, "You remember the silence after we fired?" And everyone would nod, because that silence was the memory that stayed, the waiting, the not knowing, and then the heavy, unmistakable whump that told them the war had just changed again. Historians would come to call it the moment the hunter finally learned how to hunt underwater. Before Hedgehog, depth charges had been a sledgehammer swung blind. Afterward, anti-submarine warfare became a scalpel. The England was the first perfect demonstration of that new precision, and the shockwaves it sent through both navies rippled far beyond 1944. The Japanese submarine service, already strained by losses and dwindling fuel, never recovered from the blow. When Admiral King heard the full report, he is said to have remarked, "There'll always be an England in the United States Navy." It was more than praise. It was a recognition that something new had entered the vocabulary of war. Technology had finally met discipline in a way that made the ocean's most secret battlefield visible. In the quiet decades that followed, when the ships were scrapped and the oceans filled again with merchantmen instead of war convoys, the story of England's run became something sailors told not for glory but for instruction. They would explain to younger men that precision wins wars faster than power, that listening can kill more surely than shouting, and that sometimes the loudest victory comes after the longest silence. And always, when the conversation turned to those 12 days in 1944, someone would lean back, sip his coffee, and say softly, 6 boats, 12 days, no one's ever done it again. Then they would fall quiet, listening in their minds to the sea they had once commanded, and the faint, rhythmic echo of sonar that meant, in that strange spring so long ago, the hunter had found its voice.